The nanny pretended to be a millionaire's wife for 1 week. What happened changed everything. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The morning sun filtered softly through the sheer linen curtains, casting a delicate golden pattern across the polished wooden floor of the Jones estate. It was the start of another day in Greenwich, Connecticut, and Taylor Smith, as always, was up before anyone else. With her hair pulled back into a practical bun and her uniform neatly pressed, she adjusted the collar of her blouse in the hallway mirror before heading toward the child's bedroom. She had been working there for 2 years, caring for Sarah, the 5-year-old daughter of Oliver Jones. Despite the comfortable routine and the generous salary, the house never let Taylor forget the wide distance that separated her world from theirs. The understated elegance of antique furniture, the faint scent of expensive lavender drifting through the halls, and the quiet formality of the older household staff always reminded her that she came from a place far more modest. And yet, every time, Sarah's cheerful voice echoed through the corridors, calling her name with excitement. That contrast briefly vanished. "Auntie Taylor! Auntie Taylor!" The little girl's voice rang from the stairs, followed by the quick patter of small feet across the Persian rug. Sarah appeared like a burst of energy in the hallway, her brown hair tousled from sleep, her wide eyes sparkling with joy. Taylor instinctively crouched down and opened her arms, receiving the hug that had become an essential part of her mornings. The child threw herself into her arms, giggling, already chattering about a dream she'd had and the strawberry pancakes she wanted to help make later. For a moment, Taylor allowed herself to soak in the warmth of the moment, forgetting the formality that normally framed her role in the house. It was impossible to resist Sarah's spontaneous affection. She had earned the child's trust and love through quiet dedication. She cared for her as if she were her own, though deep down she knew her place could be replaced, her presence forgotten. The sound of steady footsteps on the polished staircase interrupted the moment between them. Oliver Jones was coming down, wearing a neatly fitted suit and adjusting his cufflinks with the same precision he brought to every part of his life. Tall, dark-haired, and impeccably composed, he exuded a quiet authority that needed no words. Taylor felt her pulse quicken, just as it always did when he appeared unexpectedly. At 35, Oliver was known for his reserved nature and the quiet grief he carried since losing his wife so young. His deep brown eyes always seemed to carry a shadow that Taylor had learned to recognize. "Good morning, Taylor," he said, with his usual courtesy. She responded with a small nod, keeping her posture as professional as expected. But in that brief moment when their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. A tension, subtle yet undeniable. Sarah ran up to her father, hugging his leg with familiar joy. "Daddy! Auntie Taylor said we can make strawberry tarts today," she declared, like she had just revealed the world's best secret. Oliver smiled, not the polite one he offered at business meetings or neighborhood events, but a real smile, the kind that softened his features and hinted at the man behind the formality. Taylor watched, heart quietly tightened. It was impossible not to be moved by the closeness between father and daughter. They moved around an absence, one that seemed to tether them quietly together, and it was through that space that Taylor, in her own way, had gradually become part of their unnamed, undefined rhythm. But the shrill ring of the office phone, loud and unexpected, cut into the moment. Oliver answered immediately, his voice shifting to a sharper, more formal tone. Taylor, still nearby by instinct, observed how his expression changed as he listened. His brows furrowed, his hand ran through his hair, a rare sign of stress. When he hung up, he looked directly at her, serious. "Taylor, I need to talk to you later when Sarah's occupied." The words landed with quiet weight, a prediction of change. Taylor forced a gentle smile so Sarah wouldn't sense anything, and nodded lightly, The rest of the morning moved on with their usual activities, reading, outdoor play, snack time, but Taylor could hardly focus. Her mind kept circling back to the words Oliver had spoken and the urgency she had never heard in his voice before. Once Sarah was upstairs with Mrs. Penelope Green for her midday nap, Taylor steadied herself, smoothed the front of her uniform with damp palms, and made her way to the office. Each step down the hallway felt heavier than the last. When she knocked on the carved wooden door, his voice came from inside, calm but firm. She opened it and found Oliver standing with his back to her, facing the large windows that overlooked the backyard gardens. His hands were clasped behind him, his posture unusually stiff. He turned slowly, and there was something different in his eyes, a resolve, but also vulnerability. "Taylor," he said, his voice softer than usual, "I'm about to ask you something that may sound completely unreasonable, but I need your help." She didn't answer, just watched him closely. The tone of his voice, the way he avoided pacing, all of it made it clear this wasn't just another employer's request. This was something else entirely. Oliver gestured toward the leather armchair in front of his desk, inviting her to sit, but Taylor could tell he wasn't in a state to sit himself. He paced slowly across the office, hands clasped behind his back, a gesture he rarely used, and that now revealed the tension beneath his otherwise composed posture. She waited in silence, eyes following his every step, trying to read what lay behind his restlessness. "I got a call this morning," he said, still facing the window, "from my business partner in Tokyo." He paused briefly, but the weight in his tone lingered. "A delegation of Japanese investors is flying in on Monday to evaluate our expansion plans." His words were deliberate, each one chosen carefully. "It's a strategic deal. If it works, it could stabilize our headquarters here in the States and prevent the downsizing we're heading toward." Taylor listened, attentive but confused. She couldn't see what any of this had to do with her. "There's a detail," he continued, turning to face her. "The head of the delegation, Mr. Nakamura, places a high value on family structure. He believes strongly that a married man is more reliable in business. He grew up with that mindset. Marriage means commitment, and commitment means responsibility." Taylor leaned forward slightly, trying to piece things together. Oliver stepped toward the window again, paused, then turned and spoke more directly. "He knows I'm a widower, but he assumes I've rebuilt my life. He expects to meet my wife." The air in the room shifted. Outside, the soft hum of a car driving past could be heard, but inside, the silence thickened. Taylor folded her hands in her lap, trying to remain composed, though her fingers gave away the unease building within her. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but careful. "Mr. Jones, are you asking me to pretend to be your wife?" He met her eyes for a long moment before answering. "Yes, just for a week." He stepped closer to the desk, his tone steady. 7 days, just a few social events and investor meetings, nothing more." Taylor leaned back slightly in the chair, trying to absorb the weight of what he'd just asked. "I know it sounds strange. And believe me, I wouldn't ask if I hadn't thought it through, but I trust you. I trust your bond with Sarah, and I trust how you handle things, with discretion, balance, and kindness." His voice wasn't desperate, but there was something personal beneath the businesslike words, something that hinted at more than just a strategy. She didn't answer right away. Her thoughts went to Sarah, the way the little girl clung to her every morning, called her Auntie Taylor, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if she truly belonged. She thought of her own mother, still waiting on a postponed surgery they hadn't been able to afford, of her unfinished teaching degree, left behind years ago when money ran out, of the quiet exhaustion that had followed her through every job, every shift, every careful step she took, and how much Would you pay for this arrangement? The question left her lips softer than she'd expected, as though some part of her didn't truly want to know. Oliver gave the number simply, like it had already been decided. It was more than Taylor would earn in years of work. Enough to pay off debts, cover her mother's surgery, and even reopen the door to old dreams she had quietly buried. She dropped her gaze to the floor, her thoughts spinning. "My mom needs hip surgery," she murmured, "and I always hoped I'd go back and finish my degree." Oliver moved to sit on the edge of the desk, eyes steady on her. "You're not just a staff member, Taylor. You know that. You care. For my daughter with patience and warmth. You understand this household better than anyone, and more than anything else, you're trustworthy. If someone saw us together, they'd believe it." Her cheeks flushed. The idea felt absurd, risky even, but there was something in his voice that stirred a part of her she hadn't let speak in years. The part that had learned to survive by focusing on routine, duty, and stability. "But I don't know the first thing about formal etiquette or how to behave in those kinds of circles," she said honestly, not out of fear, but clarity. Oliver smiled softly, his first true smile since the conversation had started. It softened the lines of his face. "You have something you can't teach, natural grace, poise, presence. The rest we can rehearse over the weekend." He wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't trying to convince her with charm. It was as if he had already made the decision for both of them, and yet was leaving space for hers to be heard. He outlined the upcoming events: 2 formal dinners, a business brunch, a cocktail reception at the Carlisle, and a visit to his family's country estate in upstate New York. Taylor listened closely, each detail painting a world she had never imagined herself stepping into. "And Sarah?" she asked softly. Oliver smiled again, this time with a warmth that reached his eyes. "Sarah's going to love it. She keeps saying she wishes you were her mom." That last sentence echoed in Taylor's chest louder than all the others. She didn't give an answer that afternoon, just a slow nod and a long look filled with questions neither of them yet knew how to name. The next morning, well before sunrise, Taylor was already up. She hadn't slept much. The night had been restless, filled with looping thoughts, flashes of the conversation with Oliver, and a growing sense that something had shifted inside her. On paper, it was just an agreement. 7 days, a role to be played with elegance and restraint. But underneath it all, the proposal stirred something deeper, especially when she thought about Sarah, how the little girl might react to this performance, and the way Oliver had been looking at her lately. After making coffee and checking that everything in the house was in order, Taylor went upstairs to change. There, laid out neatly on the bed, was a cream-colored box tied with a thin brown ribbon. Inside was a new outfit, simple, refined, and a handwritten note. "For today, Oliver." When she came downstairs, she was greeted by Mrs. Penelope Green, Oliver's personal assistant, already waiting in the foyer with a slim leather folder in hand. "Mr. Jones asked me to accompany you to the image consultant. We don't have much time to get everything ready before Monday," she explained. Her tone was efficient, but not unfriendly. On the ride to a small private studio in the Upper East Side, Penelope explained the plan clearly: posture adjustments, vocabulary guidance, how to carry herself at formal events, how to sit, smile, and greet people with the right balance of confidence and poise. The training was exhausting and detailed, but Taylor absorbed it all with the focus of someone who couldn't afford to mess up. She felt out of place, yes, but not afraid. The discomfort came less from the etiquette itself and more from the idea of stepping into a life she had only ever observed from the margins. The physical transformation began with subtle choices: a lower, softer bun, minimal makeup to enhance her features, and a wardrobe curated for quiet sophistication. When Taylor finally looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The woman reflected there had the presence of someone accustomed to champagne receptions and high-rise lounges. "You were made to wear this suit," the consultant said with a brief smile, adjusting the collar of the pale grey blazer. Taylor didn't answer. She felt like someone about to walk across a stage she didn't fully know, but she also felt proud for adapting quickly, for stepping up. By the end of the afternoon, she returned to the house with a full dossier in hand, investor profiles, a crafted backstory for her supposed relationship with Oliver, and detailed guidance for the week ahead. Saturday's rehearsal began early. Oliver was waiting in the living room, with a cup of coffee in front of him, dressed in a crisp shirt and navy blazer. When she walked in, he stood up without hesitation, as if her new appearance had already settled into the rhythm of the home. "Let's practice how we met," he said, pulling out a chair for her. "We'll say you came here as Sarah's nanny, and over time our friendship evolved. Quietly, we got married in a small private ceremony a year ago." The way he spoke was smooth, almost effortless, and it caught in her chest. They went over everything. How they'd look at each other, how they'd touch, what they'd say when asked. Oliver suggested practicing subtle gestures of affection, maybe holding hands, a kiss on the cheek, whatever feels natural. When he leaned in and brushed her cheek with his lips, her breath caught. It was a small gesture, but it jolted. Something inside her like a sudden spark. Late in the morning, Sarah came skipping into the room wearing a light dress, her hair still damp from her bath. "Auntie Taylor, you look so pretty," she said, her eyes wide as she took in the new outfit, the soft makeup, and Taylor's more composed posture. "Are you going to be my real mommy now?" The question lingered in the air, sweet and a little painful. Taylor knelt down, hugging the girl gently, and answered softly, "Just for a few days, okay, princess." But the response didn't settle anything inside her. The words felt like both truth and fiction, floating in the same breath. From across the room, Oliver watched quietly. There was something in his gaze that didn't align with the cool logic of a contract. A hesitation, perhaps, or the quiet acknowledgement that they were crossing an invisible line neither of them had meant to approach. And that line was becoming harder and harder to see. In the afternoon, they visited a boutique in Manhattan's Upper East Side, where Taylor selected the dresses she would wear throughout the week. Nothing flashy, but everything carefully chosen to match the refined settings. Ahead, while she tried on a navy blue dress with lace detail at the neckline, Oliver observed her not just with approval, but something more. He said little, but when he quietly mentioned that the color brought out her eyes, something stirred inside her. A warmth that didn't belong to a rehearsal or a deal. It was nearly sunset when they returned home. The last task of the day was supposed to be reviewing the week's schedule, but instead of pulling out documents, Oliver returned with 2 glasses of chilled white wine and suggested they talk casually, as a couple would on a quiet Saturday evening. The change in tone softened Taylor. In that relaxed conversation, they wandered from books to childhood memories to favorite films. She learned he loved Flaubert. He learned she could spot constellations in the sky. The kind of things that don't show up on resumes or profiles, but linger in real connections. At the end of the night, when they said goodbye in the main hall, there was a pause. Oliver held her hand gently, his eyes lingering a little longer than necessary. "Thank you, Taylor, for everything." She only replied with a small smile. Then she climbed the stairs with her thoughts spinning, fully aware that this weekend had already changed the way she saw him, the house, and maybe even herself. Sunday dawned with a soft grey sky over Greenwich, and even so, the Jones estate felt quieter than usual. Taylor came down the stairs still slipping on her shoes, her coat draped over one arm, ready to leave with Oliver and Sarah for their final rehearsal before the official week of commitments began. That day's plan was to visit the restaurant where the welcome dinner for investors would be held. Oliver had reserved a discreet table so she could become familiar with the space and rehearse the protocol for arrivals, introductions, and cocktail conversation. Sarah, thrilled by the idea of going out with both of them, wore a floral dress and had clipped a barrette into her hair all by herself. When she saw Taylor, she ran to her and reached for her hand as naturally as if she already included her in her idea of family. Oliver watched the two of them interact with the same focus he gave to boardroom meetings, not distant, but deeply attentive. Entering the restaurant required more than just good posture. There were timed greetings, carefully chosen phrases, and a controlled tone of voice. Oliver opened the door for Taylor and Sarah, who clung to Taylor's hand without hesitation. The maitre d' guided them to a more secluded table, where a child's seat had already been prepared. Sarah took in the surroundings with wide eyes. Taylor took a deep breath, adjusted her stance, and sat beside Oliver, with Sarah nestled between them. During the meal, while the little girl played with her juice and colored in the children's menu, Taylor shifted between casual conversation with Oliver and a quiet study of the room. More relaxed than usual, Oliver remarked on the menu and at one point said softly, "Simple elegance. You can't teach that," as she delicately held her silverware, not meant for anyone else to hear. That afternoon, back at the estate, they spent some time with Sarah in the garden. The little girl insisted on playing hide-and-seek, and Oliver eventually gave in. During one round, he and Taylor ended up crouched behind the gardening shed, squeezed between planters and tools, laughing quietly while listening for Sarah's small footsteps nearby. It was then that she noticed how different Oliver became. Around his daughter, his posture less tense, his eyes softer, his voice natural and unguarded. At the end of the game, he stood and offered his hand to help her out from their hiding spot. The touch was simple, direct, but when their fingers let go, Taylor felt the absence more intensely than the contact itself. Sitting back on the grass with Sarah curled up in her lap, she glanced at the house and realized she never imagined herself there, with those people, living something so completely outside what she had planned for her life. Later, while Sarah napped in her room, Taylor and Oliver reviewed the details of the first official event one final time. They sat in the library, surrounded by leather-bound folders and 2 glasses of chilled white wine. Oliver laid out exactly who would be introduced first, how she should stand beside Mr. Takahashi, what topics to steer away from, and what kinds of questions might arise about their supposed marriage. At one point, he took her hand to demonstrate the gesture he would use to present her, placing his palm gently against her waist as though it were already second nature. The warmth of that touch lingered long after he stepped back and poured them each another glass of wine. "Are you sure you're ready?" he asked in a low voice, almost a whisper. Taylor didn't answer right away. She looked down at her glass, watching the reflection of the light in the golden liquid. When she finally met his eyes, her reply was calm and honest. "I've done harder things. Pretending to be your wife for a few days doesn't scare me." It could have come across as sarcastic, but instead it was disarmingly raw. Oliver held her gaze for a moment, then looked away and nodded. He changed the subject, shifting to the dinner scheduled for Friday, the final event before the investors left. "It'll be the most intimate of all, a garden dinner here at the house, fewer people." It's when the conversations tend to stray off script. Taylor simply nodded, trying to keep her breath steady. At this point, it was no longer just about memorizing information or mastering social codes. Living with Oliver and Sarah was taking root in ways she hadn't expected. There was no longer a clear line between what belonged to the arrangement and what had grown from real connection, and she knew it would require a different kind of self-control than she imagined at the start. Later that night, when she went up to her room, She found the dress she would wear the next day laid out on the bed. It was simple and elegant, a deep crimson shade with a classic cut. Beside it was a small box with mother-of-pearl earrings and a note. "So you feel worthy of the woman you already are." No signature, no embellishment, just the firm, precise handwriting she had come to recognize. Taylor sat on the edge of the bed, the note in her hands, and exhaled slowly. The start of the arrangement was just hours away. But this was no longer about memorizing a script. She had crossed a threshold, and whatever came next would depend less on rehearsed lines and more on how she managed everything. This closeness had already begun to awaken inside her. Monday morning began early at the Jones estate. The atmosphere was one of quiet focus. The staff moved with their usual rhythm, but there was a subtle tension in the air, as if everyone sensed something important was about to unfold. Taylor had woken before her alarm. She took a long shower, styled her hair with more care than usual, and dabbed on a soft fragrance that matched the elegance of the dress she would wear that evening. The deep red gown still hung on its hanger, waiting for the right moment. She spent part of the morning with Mrs. Green, who went over the final details regarding the guest list, conversation topics, and cocktail flow. "Don't try to impress anyone with facts," the assistant advised, while fastening an earring to Taylor's lobe. "Just look comfortable. That ease of yours has more power than you think." Taylor simply nodded. She knew her greatest strength was exactly what hadn't been rehearsed. In the early afternoon, Oliver called her into his office. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey blazer and a crisp white shirt, the cuffs still rolled up, his usual look when preparing for important meetings. "Everything's ready for tonight," he said, handing her a glass of water. "We've done our part. Now we trust it." Then he placed a small velvet box on the desk. Taylor opened it and found a ring, a delicate piece with a single diamond surrounded by tiny, discreet stones. "For tonight," he said, "it'll help reinforce the image." She slid it onto her finger, feeling the cool metal like a reminder. This whole arrangement was still a performance, just one that now held layers deeper than appearance. "If at any point you feel uncomfortable," he said, looking straight at her, "just hold my hand. I'll be paying attention." By late afternoon, Taylor was getting dressed with deliberate calm. The red gown fit her precisely, hugging her waist and falling in gentle waves down to her ankles. It was graceful, poised, secure, just how she needed to appear. Oliver came to meet her at the top of the stairs and paused when he saw her, quiet for a few seconds before offering his arm. "Ready?" he asked. Taylor took a deep breath, adjusted the ring on her finger and nodded. They walked together to the front entrance where the car was already waiting. On the way to the hotel, Oliver explained how the reception would go. The maitre d' would lead the introductions, then they'd greet Mr. Takahashi and the other guests one by one. "And what about Sarah?" Taylor asked, adjusting her bracelet. "She'll stay with Mrs. Green until we return. But she insists on being woken up when we get home." Oliver smiled more quickly this time. "She already picked out her party dress just to welcome us back." As they entered the private hall of the hotel, Taylor was immediately enveloped by the glow of chandeliers, the soft notes of instrumental music, and the refined details, low floral arrangements in white, gloved servers, and crystal glasses shimmering. Under the lights, the maitre d' greeted them with reverence. "Mr. and Mrs. Jones," he announced, guiding them toward Mr. Takahashi. The investor stood with a glass in hand and a subtle smile. Short in stature but commanding in presence, he gave them a slight nod. "It's a pleasure to finally meet your wife," he said, in accented but confident English. Taylor returned the nod with calm assurance. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Takahashi. Oliver has told me a great deal about you." The investor's gaze moved between them, pausing on the hand Oliver placed gently at the small of her back. He seemed pleased. In the minutes that followed, they moved through the room, greeting guests. Taylor kept a polite smile, answered questions with quiet confidence, and listened intently to the flow of conversation. At one point, while Oliver spoke with a Japanese executive, Taylor found herself alone with one of the investor's wives, who gently asked how she and Oliver had met. "We got close naturally, after I started working in the household," Taylor replied without hesitation. "We began to share little parts of daily life, and those small things brought us together before we even realized it." The woman smiled, clearly touched. It's rare to hear something so calm. And just then, Oliver returned and, in the nearly instinctive motion, interlaced his fingers with Taylor's. "Taylor brought harmony into my life," he said. It was said simply, but the tone didn't sound like something rehearsed. When it was time for dinner, the guests were led to an adjoining room. The round tables were laid out with care, each place elegantly arranged. Oliver pulled out Taylor's chair before sitting beside her. During the meal, she remained attentive to the order of service, the silverware, the glances exchanged across the table. Conversation flowed more easily than expected. One of the investors shared a story about his daughter, and Taylor responded with a light anecdote about Sarah, which brought genuine laughter. When Oliver spoke about balancing his business and family life, she followed with a remark about their home routines, as though they had been sharing a roof for years. The harmony between them was unmistakable, and with each look exchanged, the line between performance and authenticity blurred a little more. Not because the act was unnecessary, but because the difference between effort and spontaneity was no longer clear. By the time they returned to the house, Sarah was still awake, her hair pinned up and her dress chosen specially for the occasion. She ran to Taylor and hugged her tightly. "You look beautiful," she said with delight. Oliver knelt beside his daughter and smiled. "I think we have a little fashion expert in the house." After Sarah was tucked into bed, Taylor lingered in the hallway, quietly watching the door to the child's room. When Oliver came up beside her, she didn't move. They stood there for a moment, shoulder to shoulder, saying nothing. Then he spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "If this were real, I wouldn't change a thing." She didn't answer. She only closed her eyes for a second, and when she opened them, she slowly walked down the stairs toward her own room, where the red dress still held the warmth of her body and the scent of what, until now, had only been a carefully constructed lie. The next morning, the house was quiet when Taylor woke up. The previous day had left subtle impressions on her body and mind, not from physical exhaustion, but from an emotional tension that was difficult to name. As she sat up, her hair loose, around her shoulders, her fingers automatically brushed over the ring still on her left hand. She hadn't forgotten to remove it. She simply hadn't found the courage. The memory of the dinner, the exchanged glances, the warmth behind words, that didn't need to be so charged. All of it still lingered. She slipped into a more casual outfit and headed downstairs to prepare breakfast for Sarah, who usually woke up later on non-school days. Mrs. Green was already in the kitchen, sorting through the day's notes and schedules. "Lunch will be at the country club," she said matter-of-factly. "Two key representatives involved in the project will be there. It'll be more relaxed, but just as important." Taylor nodded without replying, focusing instead on preparing Sarah's toast with jam. A few minutes later, Oliver walked in, dressed in dark slacks and a light cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He paused in the doorway when he saw her, almost as if observing from a distance. He said nothing at first. He walked over, poured himself a coffee, and leaned against the counter. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his voice calm. "Well enough," she replied without turning around. The brief conversation didn't last more than a few seconds, but there was a pause in his movements as he left the kitchen that lingered in the air longer than it should have. Upstairs, as she got ready, Taylor wore a look that wasn't exactly worry, but it lacked the ease of previous mornings. Something between them had shifted. Not abruptly, but in-house silence now seemed to say more than words. Just before noon, Oliver was waiting for her in the foyer, adjusting his watch. Taylor wore a beige linen dress with a modest, straight cut and her hair pulled back into a low bun. When he saw her, he smiled, and this time the expression was more natural than the day before. "You look perfect for today." She didn't answer but accepted the arm he offered. In the car on the way to the club, conversation was light. Oliver explained who would be there, the tone he was expected to keep, and what would be required of his pretend wife. Casual conversations, a pleasant demeanor, and attentiveness. "Just be yourself. That always works." She gave a faint smile. When they arrived, they were received with courtesy. The place was spacious, surrounded by tall trees, with tables arranged around a terrace facing the green. It was more informal, but the social rules were still clearly in place. They sat at one of the main tables. The guests, 2 hotel investors and their wives, arrived minutes later. The lunch began with light dishes and pleasant small talk. Taylor grew more confident with each new encounter. She had learned how to listen, how to be present without overstepping. At one point, while the men discussed mergers and capital strategies, the women shifted to lighter topics: schools, vacations, food. One of them asked where Taylor had bought her dress. She responded naturally, naming a boutique in Soho, and spoke briefly about her preference for understated pieces. The conversation flowed so easily, it even surprised her. When Oliver placed his hand over hers in a light, steady gesture, she didn't pull away. She felt the firmness of his fingers and remained composed. Their interaction, though unrehearsed, was becoming increasingly seamless. One of the investors looked at them with a thoughtful gaze, not intrusive but lingering. Just before dessert, he remarked, "You two have a very calm energy. It's nice to see that." Oliver didn't say anything in response, but under the table, his thumb pressed gently against her hand. Lunch extended into coffee on the terrace. Taylor stepped away briefly with one of the women, who showed some curiosity about her day-to-day life. "Isn't it suffocating to work side by side with your own husband?" she asked with a teasing smile. Taylor answered with quiet firmness. "Oliver's a reserved man, but he knows how to share space, and he respects me." The words came easily, because deep down she believed them. Later that afternoon, when they returned home, Sarah was waiting with drawings spread across the dining room table. She had sketched portraits of the 3 of them, herself, Oliver, and Taylor. "Look, I drew our family," she exclaimed. Oliver picked up one of the pictures and was quiet for a moment. Then, with a subdued smile, he said, "Looks like we're going to need a special frame for this one." Taylor said nothing, but her throat tightened at the innocent weight of that moment. That evening, after Sarah was asleep, Oliver invited Taylor for tea in the library. The lighting was dim, the space smaller and more contained somehow. He poured their cups, moved some papers from the side table, and sat beside her on the dark leather sofa. "Today, for a moment, I forgot this. Was all pretend," he said softly. "You speak like someone who's really lived this life with me." Taylor kept her eyes on her cup. "Maybe it's just the rehearsal working." Oliver didn't respond right away, and when he finally spoke, there was no trace of a joke in his tone. "Or maybe I'm getting used to the idea." The words lingered, and this time she didn't know what to say. They stayed there, side by side, for a few more minutes, the cups empty, the kettle turned off, and the silence between them thicker than any conversation. There was no confession, no grand admission, but the atmosphere made one thing undeniable. The boundaries they'd both kept intact were slowly, quietly beginning to blur. On Tuesday morning, the sky over Greenwich was blanketed in a thick layer of clouds. The air was noticeably colder than in previous days, and the grey light that filtered through the windows gave the mansion a muted, quiet atmosphere. Taylor sat with Sarah at the kitchen table, helping the little girl arrange a small box of colored pencils while waiting for breakfast. Sarah was especially cheerful that morning, humming to herself between comments. "Today's the aquarium trip. Remember?" she said, looking up with excitement in her eyes. Taylor gently stroked her brown hair, trying to ignore the tightness in her chest. The day's official schedule didn't include Sarah, but Oliver had promised her a special outing over the weekend. It was yet another reminder that no matter how natural everything seemed, they weren't truly a family. Still, that morning, the scent of coffee, the drawings scattered across the table, the slow pace of the minutes made Taylor feel like she belonged to a life that wasn't really hers. After breakfast, she went upstairs to get ready for the day's event, a visit to the Harrington Gallery in the historic district of Stamford, where Oliver would be hosting a private gathering of collectors and curators. The goal was to nurture cultural ties before finalizing a significant partnership. Mrs. Green handed her a printed itinerary with names, times, and key points. The event called for poise, but encouraged a relaxed tone in conversation. Taylor chose a simple cream-colored dress with a straight cut and wore her hair down. Around her neck, she fastened a delicate necklace her mother had once given her. When she came downstairs, Oliver was already waiting in the foyer. The way he looked at her wasn't rushed or professional. His gaze took her in fully. Then he stepped closer and carefully adjusted the sleeve of her coat. "Ready?" he asked, his eyes still on hers. She answered with a quiet yes, unsure. Whether she was saying it to him or to herself. The gallery, located inside a preserved stone building on Bedford Street, had high ceilings, exposed brick walls, and soft lighting that gave the space an elegant calm. The art pieces were tastefully arranged, and the mood was cordial and intimate. Taylor walked beside Oliver, listening attentively as he made introductions. More than once, she was invited to share thoughts on certain pieces, on the atmosphere of the exhibition, or on cultural programs that the Joneses might support. She didn't fabricate anything. She simply responded with what she knew and what she saw, and that was enough. The sincerity in her voice as she spoke about the paintings, the genuine interest she showed in the stories behind a few sculptures, and the respectful way she engaged with the curators all left a stronger impression than any polished speech could have. Oliver watched her often, even when he tried to mask it. He noticed how she moved her hands, how she listened, how she smiled without trying to win anyone over. During a short break, they sat on a sofa near a side window, each holding a glass of sparkling wine. The ambient noise was low enough that they could talk without worrying about being overheard. "Do you realize what you're doing?" Oliver asked, his voice more personal than usual. Taylor tilted her head slightly, not following. "You're disarming everyone around you. So, effortlessly it can't be taught." She smiled, glancing away. "Maybe it's because I'm not trying to do anything except pay attention and respond." He kept his gaze on her for several seconds. "I'm not sure I'll ever get used to that." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. Minutes later, they were summoned to the main hall for the final presentation. But the quiet moment on that sofa remained with both of them, a fragment that didn't fit neatly into any category they'd been trying to stick to since the beginning of their arrangement. By the time they returned to the mansion, it was nightfall. Sarah was still awake, her eyes heavy with sleep, her stuffed bear tucked under one arm. "Tatey Taylor, you took so long," she murmured, leaning her head against Taylor's shoulder with her usual trust. Oliver smiled, slipping off his shoes before walking upstairs with the two of them. That night, he was the one who read her a story. Seated in the nursery armchair, with the soft yellow light glowing in the background, he read slowly, the words rolling off his tongue like a cherished ritual. Taylor sat nearby, watching them. At that moment, there was no pretense, no arrangement, just the three of them, sharing a moment of quiet intimacy that neither of them could have predicted. When Sarah finally fell asleep. Oliver tucked the blanket around her and left the room without a word. Taylor followed him. In the hallway, they paused across from each other. Oliver didn't speak right away. He simply looked at her, as if still processing everything they had experienced that day. "You look tired," he said, dropping the formal tone. "I am a little," she replied with a half-smile, "but my mind's still running." He nodded slowly, his gaze staying locked on hers. "Tomorrow's the final dinner," he said quietly. "After that, I'm not sure what's supposed to happen." Taylor held his gaze for a moment but gave no answer. There was fatigue in her face, yes, but also something else. Not uncertainty, but a quiet awareness that no words would be right in that moment. Oliver stepped closer, his fingers brushing lightly against her arm. They didn't say anything else. They simply stood there, unmoving, as if hovering on the edge of something neither of them was ready to define. And when they parted, they walked away in opposite directions with the same quiet reluctance, as if breaking the silence too quickly might make whatever was forming between them disappear. The morning of the farewell dinner began calmly, but a quiet sense of anticipation moved through the halls of the Jones estate. The kitchen worked at a different rhythm, with larger pots on the stove and stronger aromas filling the air. Outside, staff members were setting up tables beneath a clear canopy stretched across the garden to protect the guests in case of rain. The forecast called for cloudy skies, but Oliver didn't want to take any chances. Taylor spent part of the morning helping Sarah organize her toys, trying to steady the growing restlessness inside her. It wasn't nervousness about the investors. It was something else, something less practical, less definable. A feeling that emerged every time her eyes met Oliver's, during short pauses in their routine, during brief exchanges that lasted just seconds, yet conveyed far more than words ever could. In the afternoon, Mrs. Green helped her get ready in the guest room that had become hers for the week. Taylor wore a black dress with a modest neckline and graceful silhouette. Her hair was pulled into a low chignon, revealing her neck, and a pair of delicate earrings added a final touch of elegance. "You look perfect," Mrs. Green said softly as she adjusted the hem of the dress. Taylor smiled, but didn't reply. She knew she was ready, at least on the outside. When she came downstairs, she found Oliver waiting in the front hall. He wore a dark suit, no tie, the top buttons of his shirt left open in a way that softened the formal look. When he saw her, he held her gaze for a few seconds before offering his arm. "Ready?" She nodded once, quietly. Neither of them mentioned the night before. But there was something in their gestures, in the way their steps aligned, that showed. They were both still carrying the weight of what hadn't been said. The garden was lit with small lanterns strung from the highest branches. The tables, arranged in a crescent shape, were set with simple white flowers and candles in glass holders. Guests began arriving shortly after 7. Mr. Takahashi was the first to greet them, followed by the rest of the delegation. The mood was informal, yet no less refined. Oliver welcomed everyone with ease, and Taylor moved alongside him with the same poise she had shown all week. By the time dinner was served, she already recognized every face at the table and knew exactly how to carry herself among them. Dinner was served in thoughtful courses: a fresh salad, hearty main dish, and a warm dessert, each arriving with just the right timing. Sarah, who had eaten earlier, now played quietly in a corner of the garden with building blocks under the watchful eye of the housekeeper. Every so often she would run over to the main table to show a drawing or share something excitedly, her eyes lighting up at the sight of Taylor seated beside her father. During dessert, a string quartet began to play a waltz. A few couples got up to dance, and it was then that Oliver reached out his hand toward her. "May I?" The question came without ceremony. Taylor placed her napkin on the table, took his hand, and stood gracefully. In the center of the garden, surrounded by candlelight and tables, they began to dance in silence. His hand rested gently at her waist, and though their steps were simple, they carried a weight that felt far more meaningful than the music alone could explain. She kept her gaze lowered for a moment until she felt the light pressure of his thumb along her arm. When she finally looked up, she found his eyes fixed on her face. There were no words, no rehearsed lines, no show for the guests, only that stillness between two people who had shared too much to pretend nothing had changed. The world around them continued on, but in the narrow space between their bodies, time seemed to pause. Later, with the garden nearly empty, Oliver stayed beside her as the last guests offered their farewells. Mr. Takahashi personally thanked them for the warm reception and commented on what he called the clear harmony between the two. Taylor smiled, feeling a quiet warmth spread across her cheeks. Once the final glass was cleared from the tables, Oliver stepped away briefly to speak with the cleaning crew. Taylor walked alone to the side corridor of the house, needing a moment. Away from the lights, she stood there for a while, arms crossed, her back resting lightly against the wall. When Oliver found her, he didn't approach right away. He paused a few steps behind, simply watching. "Do you want to be alone for a bit?" he asked. She turned slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. "I don't know," she said, not sarcastically, just truthfully. He moved closer, quietly, said nothing more, and this time when he touched her hand, she didn't think about what was expected. She didn't pull away. When she felt his fingers touch hers, she didn't retreat or pretend it was just a casual gesture. They stayed like that for several long seconds, skin against skin, eyes locked, as if the entire quiet corridor existed solely for that moment. Oliver stepped closer, reducing the space between them. Taylor's body reacted before her thoughts could catch up. Too many days had been spent trapped between make-believe and longing, and nothing about that tension was easy to hold back anymore. When he lifted his hand to her face and traced her jawline with his fingers, she tilted into the touch with instinctive ease. The kiss came without hesitation, unpracticed and direct. Their lips met with the urgency of something that needed to be confirmed, something that had been carefully avoided for too long. There was no gentle start, there was no room left for restraint. Her breath quickened, and her body leaned into his like it had always belonged there. But it hadn't happened before. This wasn't memory. It was pure, released desire. Taylor's knees weakened slightly when he held her by the waist, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened, gained weight and direction. Each movement between them seemed to strip away a layer of the facade they had carefully built over the past days. Oliver hadn't lost his tenderness, but now there was something else in the way he touched her, something warmer, more intentional. His hands moved across the fabric of her dress with certainty, no rush, but no doubt either. Taylor gripped the collar of his shirt, holding on as if to ground herself, and answered his touch with her whole body, pressing closer, feeling his breath on her skin. Neither of them looked around. There was no fear. This wasn't a risk anymore. It was an unavoidable step. Without exchanging a word, Oliver pushed the guest room door open. She walked in first, and he followed, gently closing it behind them. The room was dim, the curtains drawn, the air warm. He came up behind her, and she felt his hands glide over her shoulders, slipping the straps of her dress downward. The fabric slid slowly, revealing skin already sensitive to his touch. She turned toward him, breathing unevenly, and their eyes met again. He touched the side of her face, then let his hand trail down to her neck, her collarbone. She ran her fingers beneath his shirt, feeling the warmth of his chest. He didn't speak, just watched her, intently, taking in every move she made. When he leaned in to kiss her again, their bodies came together without hesitation. what began, as closeness became full surrender. Neither rushed, but neither stalled what had long been decided. It wasn't a new step. It was the natural continuation of what had been building between them. The night unfolded without unnecessary words. Their movements filled the space in ways no conversation could. There was no longer any script. Taylor followed his lead and took her own. The barriers had already fallen. Time inside that room passed differently, and what existed between them no longer fit within the idea of a temporary arrangement. Later, when their bodies settled beside one another, neither moved to create distance. She stayed there, her head resting on his chest, while his arms circled her with a stillness that needed no explanation. Their breaths slowly returned to normal. The house was quiet, but that wasn't what kept them still. It was the shared understanding that something had shifted in an irreversible way. They fell asleep like that together without planning it, as if they had finally found where they belonged. The next morning, soft daylight began slipping through the curtains as Taylor opened her eyes. It took her a few seconds to remember exactly where she was, but the realization came without discomfort. Oliver was still asleep, one arm resting across where her waist had been. She sat up slowly, pulled her blouse from the chair, and slipped it on quietly. The clock showed a late hour for the usual rhythm of the house. She fixed her hair in front of the mirror, picked her dress up off the floor, and stepped into the hallway on careful feet. In the kitchen, she found Mrs. Green, who greeted her with a neutral look, as if nothing had changed. Sarah hadn't come downstairs yet. Taylor made coffee and toast, just like on countless other mornings, but now the gesture felt different. There was no audience, no need to pretend. The memory of the night before came back in flashes, a touch, a look, a breath caught halfway. But what filled her thoughts now wasn't the kiss, it was the after. What name would they give to this? How would they act now? She felt changed, and at the same time fully herself. When Sarah showed up with messy hair and her stuffed bear in hand, Taylor didn't miss a beat. She sat down next to her, grabbed a warm slice of toast, spread peanut butter gently, and smiled as she handed it over. The routine continued, at least on the surface, but whatever happened in the next few hours or days could no longer start from where they had been. Something had shifted, and even though nothing had been said aloud, Taylor knew Oliver couldn't deny it either. Oliver showed up shortly after breakfast, wearing a polo shirt, no blazer, his expression alert but revealing no trace of the night they had shared. He nodded politely to Mrs. Green, paused to ask Sarah about her plans for the day, and then his eyes found Taylor's across the kitchen. There was no signal, no word exchanged, just a moment in which time seemed to slow down. She was standing with a pitcher of juice in her hands, and he walked past her as though simply crossing the room. But that brief instant was enough for both of them to know something had to be said. When Sarah left with the housekeeper to brush her teeth, Oliver returned and said only, "Do you have a minute?" Taylor set the dish towel by the sink and followed him without question. They walked side by side to the back garden, a space rarely used in the morning. The silence between them felt natural, not uncomfortable. Oliver stopped by the wooden bench under the central tree and looked at her with calm sincerity. "I'm not going to pretend it was just a mistake or a moment of impulse. I don't want this to be treated like something isolated," he said, his voice low but steady. "If you want to go back to how things were, I'll understand, but I don't want that. I want to keep going." Taylor stayed quiet for a few seconds, taking in his words more calmly than she had expected. There was no pressure in his tone, no embellishment, just intention, and she understood. "I don't want to pretend either," she replied plainly. "But this changes everything." He nodded once, without hesitation, "and even so, it feels right." They sat on the bench, their knees nearly touching, and talked about what it would mean to continue living there without contracts, without titles, She no longer wanted to be seen as a nanny. He no longer wanted her to be, but there was no formal offer yet, no timeline, no grand gestures. Just desire, and for that moment, it was enough. In the days that followed, Taylor continued staying at the house as naturally as before, still under the premise of being close to Sarah. But something inside her had shifted. She no longer felt tied solely to the role she had once been hired for. She hadn't officially taken on any new title either. It was a beginning, and both of them seemed to understand that. Oliver stayed discreet, but sought her out often, and small gestures began to settle into routine. A second cup of coffee, an extended chat after Sarah's afternoon reading, glances that lingered longer than necessary. The house itself remained unchanged, but something had rooted quietly between them, calm, present, and real. It was Sarah who made it visible first. One afternoon, she walked into the living room, holding a drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands. "It's us," she said, proudly handing it over. Taylor and Oliver exchanged a look. He didn't say anything, just smiled. A few days later, he gathered the staff in the kitchen and spoke with the ease of someone who had already made a decision. Taylor is no longer an employee. She's part of this home. And before anyone could react, Sarah ran up to her and hugged her waist like she had always known. The change was received with ease. Mrs. Green gave a simple nod. The gardener poured her coffee. There was no surprise, just a faint relief in the air, as if everyone had been quietly waiting. Taylor, meanwhile, split her time between the house and her old apartment where her mother still lived. She wanted to handle things personally, making sure home care services were in place and that everything was arranged properly before making any final decisions. Only after that did she start considering more permanent changes. She returned to her early childhood education program and was genuinely excited about it. Oliver offered to help, but she insisted on doing it all on her own. Their relationship unfolded slowly. Some nights she stayed at her place, others she spent at the house. A few of her things were already in his closet. Their mornings now included her favorite coffee and choosing a new book to read at night together. Months later, the house felt different. The breakfast table now had fresh flowers she picked herself. Sarah was learning new vocabulary with colorful flashcards Taylor wrote out by hand. Oliver continued working from his office but never missed dinner with them. Bit by bit, the place had stopped being just a backdrop. It had become home. There were no public declarations or dramatic promises, just the steady presence of someone who had chosen to stay. One morning, as she was writing in her college notebook, Oliver passed behind her and kissed her shoulder without a word. She smiled and kept writing, as if that simple gesture was already part of the life they'd built. On quiet evenings, after Sarah had gone to bed, Taylor would sit with Oliver in the library. They didn't talk about the future in sweeping terms. They just shared real thoughts, small dreams, and honest plans. He told her he had found peace. She smiled and agreed. There was no urgency in their words, because they were already living everything that mattered, with nothing left to prove. The end. Did you enjoy this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another heartfelt tale. See you next time.